Hello there, everybody. I'm Al Sussman from Beatle Fan Magazine, and this is Things We Said Today, our weekly podcast, internet radio show in which we talk about all things Beatles related, and not only their history but also what's happening now. And we have a special guest tonight. Before we introduce him, I'll introduce my three co-hosts. First, the host of internet radio and I believe some terrestrial stations as well, the syndicated program Every Little Thing, Ken Michaels.
Hi there, Al. You sound great coming from the Pittsburgh area.
Yes, now in Western Pennsylvania, so we're in many different locations.
Spread out
and
all across the country.
All over the country, including are you just outside of San Francisco or in San Francisco? Steve.
Oh, I'm out. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm outside San Francisco.
Outside San Francisco. And that voice belongs to the Examiner, Beatles Examiner, and various Examiner columns, reporter Steve Marinucci.
Hi, Al. Hi, everyone.
And then in Maine, we have our resident classical music expert, musicologist, Beatles music expert, et cetera, longtime contributor to Beatle Fan, and that would be Alan Cozen.
Hello, Al. Hello, everyone.
And we have a special guest. If you've attended the Fest for Beatles Fans anytime in, say, the last 3 years, you know this man. He's the author of an exhaustive and very heavy two-part look at the three Beatles tours of the U.S. in 1964, 65, and 66. It's an amazing pair of books. And his name is Chuck Gunderson.
Hello, gentlemen. It's great to be with you, and pleasure to be with four distinguished Beatle people that I love very much. So thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. And where are you coming from, Chuck?
Yes.
Right now?
I'm coming from a very small town 2 hours north of Las Vegas called St. George, Utah. Mm-hmm. And we'll be living here for a little bit longer, then hopefully getting back down to our home of San Diego, California. That's where we're raised and bred, and that's where I love.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to start off now. We actually, Chuck and I have done panel discussions and one-on-one interviews and various things many times at the fest. So this is going to be old territory, but I figure the audience really should kind of know about this because, first of all, Chuck, you're out of the public relations area, right, or the advertising world?
Yeah, I spent most of my life in the advertising world, over 35 years, but I also have 2 degrees in history. I have a master's, BA from San Diego State University, and then a master's from University of San Diego. So history is really my passion, and of course I've been a Beatle fan forever. I attended my first Beatle Fest in 1979, I believe, so I've been on the circuit for a long time. Mm-hmm. And so finally, when I had some time in my life, I really turned my sights to writing these pair of books.
And what led to writing that pair of books?
Lots of things. Number one, I love Mark Lewison, great friend of mine. Mm-hmm. Mark wrote that fabulous book, Beatles Live, pre-internet days. Okay, I don't know how he found out all that information. I still refer to that book today. I love that book. It was the inspiration for what I wanted to do. And I've been a collector for many years as well. And as you know, in the Beatle world, you can collect lots of things. And I decided that I really wanted to set my sights on North American tour memorabilia, which, there's not a lot of things to collect, but on a budget you can collect things. So I kind of paired those two things up, and I kind of realized that, Mark had documented all the concerts, but there wasn't a lot of detail, wasn't a lot of photos, memorabilia, things like that. And I thought, why don't I turn my sights onto the 3 North American tours? Because no one has really tackled all 3 together. I mean, we have Larry Kane's marvelous book, Ticket to Ride. Bruce Spies covered the first visit in February, but no one had ever really done the 3 tours. So I thought that's right up my alley, and I know how to research, and I'm going to do it. But I set some very lofty goals, and I think because of those lofty goals, that's why it took me 8 years to finish the project.
Absolutely. And you just mentioned Bruce Spicer. So obviously Bruce was a major factor in the completion of this project.
Yeah, Bruce is a great friend of mine. I've known him for quite a while. And I always told Bruce, I go, Bruce, you need to do your next book on the tours. And he said, Chuck, I'm too busy. I would ask him every Beatle Fest that I would see him at, come on, Bruce, when are you going to do that? Because the thing about Bruce is not only is his research unparalleled, but the way he puts a book together. I mean, he spares no expense. He, great photographs, great, weight to the book, and it's just a beautiful product. And so I kind of wanted to marry all these things together, the knowledge of Lewison, the beauty of Bruce's books, and of course his expertise. And so I told Bruce one Beatle Fest, I said, hey, let me do this project. I know you're busy. I really have time now. I want to do it, and I'm going to do it. And he said, go for it. And he's been a great mentor through the process and remains a great friend today.
Absolutely. Well, before I start hogging the questions like I do at the fest, let me send you over to Ken, because I'm sure he's got plenty of questions of his own.
Oh, yeah. And by the way, Chuck, the book, people always ask me, and I'm sure they've asked people here on this show what books they recommend on the Beatles. Yours is amongst the top because it's the most comprehensive look that there could be on those 3 years and the shows that the Beatles did here in North America. Everything you'd ever want to know about each concert is covered in the book, so I have to commend you for that. The last time you were on our show, which was with just Steve and me, we were talking a lot about the year 1966, and sometimes I find it hard to understand how some of the shows in 1966 didn't sell out. But what I was amazed to find, because I really wanted to focus on 65 for this show, although we can expand beyond that, is that so many of the shows in 1965 didn't sell out from the Beatles.
Yeah, you're
outside
right.
of outside of Shea and the Hollywood Bowl shows and the show in Portland, Oregon, most of the other ones I believe didn't sell out at all. So why do you suppose that was?
Well, there's lots of factors. I mean, you would think that the thing that we hear most, obviously, is the Shea concert, August 15th, 1965, 55,600 seats. And a lot of people have the mistaken belief, Beatle fans, casual fans, things like that after Shea, they sold everything out, both on the 65 tour and the 66 tour. And when I started looking at the numbers, it just wasn't the case. But let's look at something. I mean, to bring 30,000, 35,000 people to a venue in the mid-'60s to see a rock and roll act was quite a feat. And so despite them not selling out venues post Shea Stadium, they brought a heck of a lot of people to go see concerts.
Right. Was it difficult to figure out which venues to book the Beatles? Because I know that you say in your book they were conscious of trying to play areas that they hadn't played the previous year. We're talking 65 here. And at the same time, they had to be so careful, the size of the venues, because this was as big a leap in terms of size as you could get. So not only that, but there were certain venues that they played twice, where they did an afternoon and evening show. So they had to put that thought process together. Could they sell out both shows in the same day? So was that a tough process to go through?
Yeah, it was. And you have to put it kind of in historical context. In 1964, when they came back in August, in the early January or the spring of 64, Brian met with General Artists Corporation, Norman Weiss. He was the vice president of that New York talent agency. And Norman had sent him a big, long list of the cities, the venues, and where they could play. And Brian went through that list, and I've actually got it copy of it in the book. I mean, all the pages, there's coffee stains all over it and everything. And I imagine he poured over this thing, you know. Here's the deal, though. I mean, the Beatles were used to playing to people in the UK, 2,000, 3,000 seats a night. You know, when they played the Empire Cool, you know, for the NME Awards, you know, they're looking at about 8,000 people there. Then they go down to Australia and they play to 10,000 people down there. But once they get to the States, the venues are much larger. And GAC kind of just threw everything against a wall, you know, and had Brian select it. So Brian had offers to play at, you know, Detroit's Tiger Stadium, 50,000 seats. And he had offers to play at Fenway Park in Boston. He had offers to play the LA Coliseum, 80,000 seats in LA. Elvis had played some venues and when he was going around, but you know, the largest venue he played was the Cotton Bowl, like 26,000 seats. So here are these things just be thrown at Brian. Brian's somewhat unfamiliar with the American market. I mean, he's relying on GAC to give him some great advice and things like that. But I think Brian was intuitive as he went through this list, realizing so Brian was given this selection of all these large venues. And you have to remember, too, like rock and roll managers, I mean, they don't have the greatest reputation. Back then, they were always out for themselves and not really looking out for their artists. And, you know, with Brian being offered all these huge venues all around the country, he could have milked it for all he was worth. But instead, what he decided to do, and I think it's to Brian's complete credit, he doesn't get a lot of credit for this, is he chose venues that were smaller. He chose arenas. He chose outdoor amphitheaters in 1964. Sure, he played 3 stadiums in 1964, and they weren't sellouts either. But they drew a heck of a lot of people. And so Brian, he could have really just burned the bridge right there in 64 by booking these huge venues and not a lot of people filling those venues. But instead he did the opposite, and what that did is it created this pent-up demand. So when they did come back in 65, and especially that Shea Stadium show, which, in my opinion, New York City is the epicenter of everything Beatles, he was able to fill that, 55,600 seats.
Right. Just one other question about, well, in general, one thing that I found to be quite interesting, and maybe there's a reason behind it, is that for all 3 years, 64, 65, and 66, they always played in Toronto at Maple Leaf Garden. Is there any particular reason for that?
The most graced stage in all North American Beatles tour history is Toronto Maple Leafs Garden. That stage was graced 6 times by the Beatles, which is pretty amazing. But I want to go back on a question you asked, Ken, and how the cities were selected and things like that. When the Beatles come to America those 3 years, they're for sure 100% always going to play the big cities. They're going to play New York. They're going to play Chicago. They're going to play L.A. They're also going to play regional cities where Beatle records are selling. And so that's why in 1964 you got a lot of concerts up in the Rust Belt, because you look at the Rust Belt now, which is Michigan and, Illinois and places like that where manufacturing was happening and where people were living. I mean, they really spent a lot of time up in the Northeast, and that's where a lot of Beatle records were selling. And in Canada, they're going to obviously play the major cities. They only played West once in Vancouver, but they're always, every 3 years, they're going to go to a major city in Canada, and that happened to be Toronto. So to answer your question, the major cities always got them every 3 years. And then the lesser-known cities, the smaller regional cities, had the fortunate luck to have the Beatles come through town.
Okay. And if you notice, when you look at the schedule for 66 particularly, you're seeing a lot less of those, as Chuck just said, the Rust Belt cities. You don't see Indianapolis, and you don't see, as a matter of fact, Pittsburgh and some others. You know, they're mostly the major markets, and of course the fact that they were in those major markets on that 66 tour, they were playing largely stadiums.
Yeah, well, in 64, as I mentioned, they played 3 stadiums. And a lot of people think that after they played Shea Stadium in 65, that the Beatles only played at stadiums. And that's a bit of a misnomer because in 65, they played 5 stadiums, but they also played 5 arenas. And, of course, the Hollywood Bowl, which was an outdoor venue. The difference is with the smaller venues, like the arenas and the Hollywood Bowl, instead of playing one show like they did in 65, they're going to do 2 shows, no doubt. So they're going to play 5 big stadiums, and then they're going to play 5 arena or outdoor amphitheaters, but they're going to add a second show to that to rake in more money. So they made as much or more money in half the time in 65 than they did in 64 when they had to play 32 shows in 33 days. So Brian had it figured out.
Right. Very true. Very true. Alan, let me see what you have to contribute here.
What I'm actually interested in is, the activities of the tours and everything are obviously fascinating, but I'm sort of interested in other aspects of how the book came together. You have probably every significant document referring to the tours reproduced in here and reproduced in color so that you can see, the ink of the signatures is different from, everything else. And I'm just wondering, how you managed to pry these things loose from the people who had them, and whether you were surprised that they still existed even. And also, how you managed to get a lot of the detail here. I mean, this really sort of this book puts you sort of right in the car with them. You know what they're eating for almost every tour stop, and who brought it to them, and other very arcane things. And the research on that must have been astonishing, because quite a lot of people who have the materials that you wanted to reproduce here usually don't let you do it. So how did you manage to get all of that?
Well, Alan, a simple answer is a lot of begging.
I see. That worked.
Yeah, but that was one of the goals for the book. I mean, I had seen other books that just had scant information in it, maybe a middle section of photos, black and white, thin paper, just not well produced. So what I did, having a master's in history, I know how to research. I learned that. I learned how to do that. So you always first thing you want to do is always go to the primary sources of the day. You want to go to the newspaper banks and all that and read all those articles and all the teen magazines and everything that you can find, because they're pretty reliable, believe it or not. It's amazing, though, that when the Beatles came to towns, the paper hardly published anything about the visit. They didn't publish the set list. And that's why in some cities we still don't know if certain songs were played. We're still trying to figure that out. But another goal of the book was not only getting these documents, which is an incredible find. And remember, this took 8 years to produce, so I had lots of time to try to procure these documents. And when you read the documents, it really gives you a window as to what was going on behind the scenes. Reading Brian Epstein's 6-page manuscript that GAC typed up for him with all the venues that they could have played on the 64 tour, and Brian's tea stains on the paper and Brian's handwritten notes on the paper, it really gives you an insight as to how he thought about this and how everything transpired. So, yes, getting the documents was paramount in putting this book together. It was a huge boon to get all these things. So, and I've been a collector for a lot of times. A lot of these are in my possession, so I just took them out of my collection. And then another goal was the photographs. How many times have we gotten Beatle books and looked forward to getting them? And it's like, oh yeah, I've seen that. Oh yeah, I've seen that photo. I really wanted to find photos that had been lost for decades. And another goal was to have photos from every stop they made in North America, which was quite daunting to begin with. And it really came down to the end. After 8 years, I was still scurrying around for a few cities. In places like Montreal, that's a hard place to work because, it's French Canadian up there. You got to speak French. So I actually had to hire someone to help me up there to unearth some of these photos. And so I'm really proud to say that in the book, in the 2 volumes, there are photos from every show they did. And they're not just stage photos. They're press conference photos, they're airport arrival photos, photos from the hotel room, just out and about type photos. I even have a photo of like the plane landing on the tarmac, which by plane, looked up the tail number on that plane, and that was the plane that crashed in 1966, killing everyone on board. So it's just like little details like that I love to kind of do. And then lastly, to reproduce them in a high quality format. And this is where my people that helped me with my book, Brad Zukroff and Bambi Nicklin from Omnivorous Media, they told me, they said, Chuck, if you're doing a book like this, it's got to be really nice, and we suggest you doing this. And I'm so glad I listened, because we did extra thick paper. It's an enlarged book. It's all the photos and documents and memorabilia have spot varnish on them, so they come off the page. We have like pages dedicated just to one contract, so you can read all the fine print and everything. And that was kind of the goal, and I hope that I accomplished that.
No, definitely. With the photos, I mean, in a way, you would have been competing with Apple, which has been voraciously gobbling up every photo collection it can get its hands on. So did you run into some frustrations in terms of rights and things?
Yeah, at the very beginning when I was researching the Las Vegas show, the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Bureau actually owns the archive of the Beatles' visit to there. And so when I contacted them and told them about the book, they said, Chuck, there's no problem. Go ahead, use the photos, but there's one caveat. And I said, well, what's that? They said, you have to get permission from Apple to use them. I thought, oh, wow, that's, I'm thinking this under my breath, obviously. So I contacted someone that knew people at Apple. I didn't know anybody at Apple. They said, just email this person. I said, okay. And I emailed them on a Thursday. And I actually got a reply on Monday, and they said, we look forward to this project. You're more than welcome to use these photos, which was amazing to me, and I really appreciated them doing that for me. But a lot of these photos that I got are actually in public archives, because I called not only, colleges, universities, historical society, both state historical societies, county archives, state archives, city archives, libraries from all over the United States. And it's interesting, some libraries in Denver had photos from New York, and some libraries in New York had photos from San Diego. So matching that all up and then trying to figure out the photos again as to what city they were in, that was really difficult. And so one thing I followed was my mantra on that was follow the clothing.
Right.
Follow the clothing, because you'll
which
know.
Conscious John wore the cap at and which ones he didn't. And,
and getting off the plane and what they were wearing the day before and So it's piecing all that together.
Before we bring Steve into the discussion, when you mentioned the lack of set lists in the the contemporary reportage of the tour, especially in '64. It reminded me of a discussion that you and Alan and I think Bruce and I had at the New York Fest in February of last year. And that takes in also Alan's ebook, Got That Something. And that's the fact that we, I guess, even to this moment, still do not definitively know the last time that the Beatles performed I Want to Hold Your Hand.
That's right. That's right. I'm still looking.
Alan, don't give up, because you have a researcher still hot on the trail. I'm beating down every bush I can find. I'm actually still going to answer your question. And I hope to find, because you know what? Luckily, the fans kept historical records. And the record they kept was their program. And on their programs, in their neat little handwriting, they wrote in order the song list. And so I'm hoping the Paramount program will arrive someday on eBay or at an auction we're inside or on the back cover, which is a very nice place to write notes, we'll see the song list. So I think we'll finally find out one of these days if they did sing I Want to Hold Your Hand at the New York Paramount to end the tour in '64.
Right. And that would have been the last time that they could have performed it. We just don't know whether they did or didn't, because a peculiarity of I Want to Hold Your Hand seems to have been that when they dropped any song in the 1964 set list, it was that. So, so we just don't know whether they did it or didn't.
And we're still trying to find out if they played Kansas City in Kansas City. I have half the people say they did, half the people say they don't. I also, in Minneapolis, someone had told me that when they played there in '65 that they dropped Twist and Shout because John had a very scratchy throat. But I'm thinking to myself, well, he sang the rest of the songs at the concert.
Right.
That one, so, sometimes it doesn't make sense. But until we see several documents, historical documents, meaning tour programs, with fans' handwritten scrawls on it, we're not going to know. So we're always going to keep an eye out for that.
One question that you had left open at the time that you finished the book was whether or not they actually had stage monitors, as claimed by the sound guy in Atlanta. Have you gotten closer to discovering whether that's true or not?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alan. And in the book, I actually kind of knew the answer, but what I wanted to do was to let the fans decide. So I presented both sides of the story. But the story is that Baker Audio, a Peachtree Street address in Georgia, one of the leading sound pioneers in the Southeast, decided at Atlanta Stadium when they played there on August 18th, 1965, that they would provide foldback speakers or sound monitors on stage so the Beatles could actually hear themselves. So we have a bit of evidence on that and luckily we have a great bootleg from that show, and Paul mentions how loud it is. She's a woman, and before Dizzy Miss Lizzy, John says, "Hey, we can hear ourselves." So the problem was we didn't have a lot of photos from Atlanta, and a good friend of mine who lives down there said, "I think I know where I can get some." And so he sent me 5 or 6 stage photos, and of course it was the standard stage setup that you would have saw at Shea Stadium or any of the other stops, and the standard stage setup you would have saw in 1966. What's interesting is that a few weeks ago, I was sent a photo, and I posted it on my Facebook page. If you go to Facebook, Beatles Some Fun Tonight, you'll see this new photo that I found from Atlanta that shows kind of a ground shot, a corner shot that shows a gaggle of speakers, huge speakers. And actually, my book friend who helped, Brad Zucroft, helped with the book, actually knew what those speakers were and commented. So you can look at the comments on that. He knows exactly what they are, but it doesn't really appear to have any speakers pointing back towards them. Baker Audio today will still say that they invented the foldback monitor and was on stage that night, but a lot of the sound engineers that I've talked to who worked during that time just said the technology wasn't available. They're clearly not on the stage through photographic evidence, but Baker claims that they were on the field about 15 to 20 feet away from the stage. So until we see those photos, we'll never know. But we have a good evidence with that new photo I posted on my Facebook.
Yeah, that photo, I'm looking at it now, it goes pretty close to 15 to 20 feet away in front of them, and you see speakers facing out, it looks like.
Right,
out
but
into
not
the future.
facing in.
Yeah.
Interesting. I know that Steve is chomping at the bit to get in on this discussion.
Sorry,
so
Steve.
Let's bring Steve in.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. Actually, you kind of got into part of what I was going to ask, was if anything else had turned up since the publication of the book, and is there a possibility that you're going to issue a supplement of some kind with any of the new material that's shown up, Chuck?
At this point, I am not going to do that. I've decided that what I printed is what I printed, and as soon as they're gone, they're going to be gone. And I did a low print run. It wasn't very high. I think about half of them are gone now. So I'm going to have a huge holiday sale coming up here in October where you'll get a lot of money off by purchasing the book. But I just didn't want to go in that direction. And if the books sell out, what I'd kind of like to maybe turn my sights to is the world tours. Maybe start Sweet in 63 and end in the Philippines in 66 and do the same type of format.
Wow.
That would be wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be very wonderful. I was also going to ask we've seen how big tours are done today, and obviously it was quite different. The Beatles were somewhat closer to the fans than a lot of the stars are now. I mean, how was it? How much more dangerous was it for them then?
Well, in 64, I think they really learned a lot. I mean, if you look at some of the archival video of them arriving at the Sahara Hotel, I mean, it's a crush. I mean, they're being handled and touched, and they're barely getting into a secure area. So I think they learned a lot in 1964. And as a matter of fact, in the 1965 tour rider, Brian added 50 more policemen. He wanted 100 in 64. He wanted 150 in 65. But another thing that they changed in 65, and I've talked to Mark Lewison about this, and I think this is another Beatle first. We talk about all these firsts that the Beatles introduced, was the backstage pass. There was nothing in 64 where you could, it's like an all-tour pass. I know there was some stuff at the Hollywood Bowl that Bob Eubanks printed up for the DJs and special guests. But in terms of having all access during the whole tour, there was nothing like that. And in 1965, Tony Barrow came up with the idea, hey, let's print up this pass. Of course, it's in the book, but it's basically an identification pass. And they were given to the support acts. They were given to people closely associated with the tour, like GAC, the promoters, and different things like that. So if you wanted to get close to the Beatles in 1965, you had to have this pass. And in 66, they even added another layer of security, and they added a different color pass. It was a red pass. The red pass was the Beatles' inner circle, and I actually have Brian Epstein's red pass printed in the book. So those are the really high level, you're not going to get to the Beatles unless you show this red pass to get to the inner sanctum.
You know that Candlestick is now gone. I have not been by there since they tore it down, but since the McCartney show, it's gone. It is now gone. And I actually got to take a tour of the backstage area before they tore it down. And nothing had changed back there. It was really amazing how much it was the same. We even looked in the bathrooms. We were comparing Jim Marshall photos of the area, and nothing had changed back there. It's really strange. It's too bad they had to take it all down, but they did. And where they tore it down. There's also, and I don't know if, like I said, you say you're not going to do anything, but I saw a long time ago some negatives or some pictures from the plane flight between Los Angeles and San Francisco. And the reason I remember that is because Joan Baez was in one of the pictures. I don't remember which year it was, though. So, but anyway, there are those out there, too. But in any event, Chuck, looking through the book again today, it's just, I have to concur with what Alan said. It's absolutely amazing, the detail in that book. It's just absolutely stunning. Is there a real possibility you'll do the world tours, or is this just something you're kind of throwing around?
I'm kind of throwing it around right now. It's kind of like Mark Lewis, and like, when's that next book coming out? Oh, 25.
Yeah,
we'll be dead. Our kids will read it, kind of thing. These things take a lot of time, and I can imagine how much more time it would take dealing with international contacts, and dealing with people in France and Italy and Spain and the Philippines. It would really be tough, and I'm up for the task. But you mentioned Candlestick Park. What an iconic place to be demolished. And in the back of each book, I actually give an update on every venue they played and every hotel they stayed at and the current status. And the address, if you're driving around, you can go look at it, There's a few places that, a lot of places are gone, but there's a few places that are still intact. Steve, there's one right out by you where they stayed in '65 at the Cabana. I believe it's it's a Hilton or one of those properties or a Westin.
Yeah, I believe you said in the book it's a Crown Plaza or something like that.
Crown Plaza. It's still there.
Right, and I've been there.
They were going to have a Beatles night there. The other you should have went to that. They were doing something over there. Right.
I wasn't aware of that. I have been there though. I was there a couple of years ago, and we toured the Beatle. They have what's called a Beatle room, and they don't say who stayed in the room. I suspect it was probably not one of the group. I suspect it was probably somebody from the party though. But they do have one of the rooms reserved, and it has a plaque on the door and says Beatle Room. I mean, that place hasn't changed very much either. It's really, and what's weird about that though is it's like now if you were to drive from that hotel to Candlestick Park, it's like about 40 minutes away, whereas back in '65 it wasn't that at all. There wasn't that much traffic, but.
Exactly. They stayed way out there in '65, which wasn't really close to Candlestick. But if you want to hear a great story about hotels and things like that, when anybody meets Bruce Spicer, after you buy his book, or books, I should say, ask him to tell his story about his stay at the Deauville Hotel in Miami Beach, and you'll get a kick out of it. Because the hotel had just identified the room for years and years and years, and Bruce said this is the real room, so they had to correct their history.
Very true. You mentioned the lessons that the Beatles hierarchy learned from the '64 tour, and yet there was an incident in Houston that posed actually real danger to them.
Yeah, the Houston stop was quite amazing. They had played Atlanta Stadium that night and then got on their chartered plane and flew over to Houston, which again, this is something today's rock stars just don't do. I mean, they're so pampered. The Beatles were hardworking. I had so much respect for these guys. I mean, they'd play a show and get on the airplane and fly in the middle of the night, land in the city, and go to all these places. But Houston, they land they're like 2:00 in the morning or something, and there's 4,000 or 5,000 people there in 1965 waiting to greet them. They were going to play Houston in '64 at Colt Stadium, but Brian elected to play Dallas. So they're pretty excited to see him. So as the plane is taxiing on the runway and, 4 turboprops spinning, they break the barriers down and run onto the tarmac while this thing is taxiing around. And, back then a lot of people smoked, and there's, the engines are running, and the Beatles are having quite a bit of fun with this, and reading Tony Barrow's account of this, they were making bets as to, who could, because they were thinking about taking off again, and they were saying, well, let's see who can stay on the wing the longest as we take off. But they were climbing up there and, knocking on the plane windows and all that. And it actually held up their exit from the plane for almost a half an hour. The Houston airport officials actually had to get a elevated baggage cart over there to the plane, and they lifted it up to the rear entry. And the Beatles had to jump onto this thing. I have heard some reports, though, and this is another one of these I would like to know if it actually happened, that Brian Epstein actually fell to the ground and injured his back, and that's kind of what started the whole painkiller thing. I'm not sure if that's true. I don't believe that's true. I think there would have been bigger press about that. And it's a long way down from a rear end of a plane. We're talking probably 15 to 18 feet. I mean, I don't know if Brian would have done so well, but there are pictures in the book of him sitting in this elevated baggage cart as fans surround it as they try to get the Beatles to the Houston terminal.
Very interesting. Now, that night, the Beatles played 2 shows at the Sam Houston Coliseum. And those 2 shows, later on, I guess in the 70s, became one of the best Beatles bootlegs. What was the source of, especially the high quality of that recording? Or those recordings were too sharp.
I think that was my first Beatle bootleg record I ever bought. Of course, it had pictures of them at Shea Stadium in 1966.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. But man, it looked good to me. And, Sam Houston Coliseum, this must be some big outdoor venue in Houston. That's what I'm thinking as a kid. But it wasn't. And, we've just realized these things have kind of just trickled out through the years, along with Alan's wife, Danish wife. Imports came in too,
I was Dutch.
There were sound engineers back then, and they got some great recordings. It's so wonderful to have this historical archive that we can go back to and listen, and even some of them are not complete. Like if you get a great thing from the Atlanta show in '65, a lot of versions don't have Dizzy Miss Lizzie in it.
Yeah.
And you got to find the one that has Dizzy Miss Lizzie. But fortunately and thankfully for those sound guys at whoever did it, we have a great archive, and we really have to thank Tony Barrow for recording that last show. But I'm still sad today that cassette ran out after 33 seconds of Long Tall Sally.
Isn't that unbelievable? In a lot of cases, didn't radio stations record them? You mentioned a couple of radio stations that were going to provide start to finish coverage, and you don't say whether or not that includes the concerts, but it sounded to me like the Houston shows, for instance, must have been recorded by a radio station. They're clearly not audience recordings,
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, and because radio stations wanted to simulcast these things because they felt that, hey, if we got the opportunity to promote the Beatles, like we're the ones that are the official sponsors, we're going to record this thing and we're going to share it with our fans, the fans that couldn't go because there wasn't any tickets available. Mm-hmm. But Brian was so just worried about anything getting out. It's early anywhere in America, obviously. Remember in Jacksonville, they weren't going to come on stage until those 5 cameramen from L.A. were going to pack up their stuff and get out of town, which Derek Taylor just waited on stage until that happened. Brian was worried about Denver and recording the show there, and he tried to get one of the KRLA jocks he berated them for trying to record the show, which he wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there. So he was very aware and wanted to keep the product pure.
Sort of too bad, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really.
I can understand his point of view at the time, but these recordings are now really the stuff of history. It lets you know a lot about what went on.
Oh, very much so. And also a little bit of, pop culture history as well, when you have things like the prelude to the Sam Houston shows with Russ Knight, who was kind of the big disc jockey in that part of Texas.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So you hear a little bit of his patter and scolding the crowd and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, actually, if I were, he says, I would be more embarrassed if I were him than if I were the Beatles.
Well, yeah.
Right.
So, ladies and gentlemen, please sit down because you're not going to see a blessed thing if you don't sit down. But I've been hearing too, and maybe you guys know more. I've heard of a tape floating around from the '66 Toronto show that even has all the support acts. Has anybody heard that?
Actually, I was given part of that, and I actually ran excerpts when they auctioned it off. I don't have the whole thing though. But yeah, when they auctioned it off, the auctioneer sent me excerpts of it, and I was able to use part of them. I remember that very well.
Does Barry Tashian know about that?
He doesn't.
Because it seems like he's made almost a career out of the Barry and the Remains little their little 15 minutes of glory opening for the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think for for some of these festivals that are around the country. I think Barry Tashian would be a great guest, and no one's really kind of gone after him. I think he's a great guy. I've spoken with him. I think he'd be available to do things and play. He's still a musician today.
Yeah.
He has appeared at Beatle conventions before, but it's been a while.
Long time.
I know he was at one of Charles's conventions. This is quite a while ago. It's got to be over 10 years ago.
Mm.
I'm looking up my information on that tape, and it has the Ronettes. I'm not sure. I'm looking to see if it has everybody, who else it has. But it definitely has the Ronettes.
The Ronnie-less Ronettes.
Mm-hmm. The file I have is marked the Ronettes. So let me see. Okay. Ooh, really? This says there is pre-show announcements. Then the remains. The remains are on here according to this.
Sure.
Then Bobby Hebb. Then the Circle. Then the Ronettes. Then the Beatles. And then after show interviews. So, yes. Yeah, all that's all on there. So there you go.
Well, let's hope a Dutch import comes over this way.
Yeah, again, that's a little slice of pop music, of pop culture right there. With with the Circle, who had the only 2 hits they really only ever had that very summer.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that sort of surprised me, I've read it before, but never quite believed it. But the degree to which the Beatles were involved in choosing the other acts in a lot of cases. I always thought, when they said, oh, the Beatles, and it specially invited them, I always thought that was just hype. But it turns out, reading your book, that they did in a lot of cases. The thing about Cannibal and the Headhunters, and you say that Paul said he wanted the na-na-na-na guys, and others too. It's kind of interesting. You'd sort of think that if it was widely known that the Beatles had actually wanted these specific performers to be on the bill with them, that people might have listened to them more carefully.
True.
Exactly. But there's, you look at all 3 years, and there were some great support acts. I mean, let's face it. The Bill Black combo minus Bill Black. I mean, if anyone should have been with the, touring with the Beatles, it would have been Bill Black. I mean, they love Bill and his bass playing. Paul owns his bass
now, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. Well, they were a complete natural, to be there. But I think, GAC had most of the responsibility for hiring the support acts. I know that Jerry Weintraub was involved in putting together the Discotheque Dancers, one of my favorite support acts. How Steve would look in those white go-go boots, but they were great. And then 64, you had the Exciters. That group changed Dusty Springfield's life and got her into the music that she wanted to play. Mm-hmm. Jackie DeShannon, Frogman Henry, the Circle.
King Curtis. King Curtis.
Sure.
Yeah, I have to agree, Al. I mean, those 2 Circle songs were amazing in '66. I mean, I think they were some of the best songs of '66.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
No question.
And what's really strange is I'm looking over the set list here. They did, besides Red Rubber Ball and Turn Down Day, they did Red Rubber Ball twice. They did Money. They did I Get Around, This Diamond Ring, Big Girls Don't Cry, and Hushabye.
Wow.
And Stay. So.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. That's really.
That's a long set for.
Sure is.
It's the diversity. I mean, they covered the Beach Boys, Gary Lewis, the Four Seasons. Hushabye is also another Beach Boys song, and Stay would also be the Four Seasons. So
sure.
I mean, a number of people.
They covered it.
Right, they're both doo-wop songs from the late 50s that they covered.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to do in the book was to pay homage to the support acts, because I really knew that these people traveled with the Beatles or were a part of the tour. And so I really wanted to dedicate a section of the book for each year, for each support act, and actually wrote 1,000 words about each one and included photos of them. because they just didn't get a lot of publicity back then. And some of them are around. I mean, a couple of the Circle guys are around. We've talked about Barry Tashian. She's around. He's around. I even interviewed a couple of the discotheque dancers who are around.
And Bill Medley from the Righteous Brothers.
Just talk like a Dutch uncle to get her to share some photos that she had locked in a vault of her on the plane with the Beatles.
Wow.
So that's.
What about Sounds Incorporated?
Oh, one of my favorites. Come on. Everybody say what? Yeah, right?
Yeah.
They were the last group to be on stage before the Beatles came on, and we amazingly see a great historical document in the Shea Stadium film of them. Mm-hmm. They brought a lot of energy to that stage and really revved the crowd up for when the Beatles got on stage. Because these people are sitting here by this time at least an hour and a half.
Sure.
Their lungs are just, dead already. Their voices are dead, waiting for the Beatles. They're frustrated. All cried out, and the Beatles come on and they get to see him for 30 minutes, and that's it. It's over.
Now, there's never been any tape that's emerged of any form aside from that Leonard Harris news film, talking to the fans before the show and saying, "Aren't the Beatles finished?" That kind of thing. But there's never been any tape that's emerged from the '66 Shea Stadium show.
No, there isn't. It's really, really strange why it hasn't. And a couple differences between 65 and 66. The one difference, there was about 11,000 less seats.
Right.
But like Ringo said in Anthology, he said, "Gee, the Beatles only sold 45,000 seats. I guess they're all out of style."
Yeah.
And one other difference between 65 and 66 was Ringo's not on a drum riser in 66. He's just down on the stage. So they must have trashed it after the 65 show and never decided to build another one or never wanted to. So he's down on the floor with the group on that show.
Hey, Chuck, can you give us an example of what you would consider to be amongst the most interesting of the radio wars? Because there's so many stations, the top 40 stations of the time, that were competing with each other to sponsor these concerts. And one thing that I didn't know until reading your book, that the reason why the Beatles played at Candlestick Park in '66 was because were the leading DJs in San Francisco, who are also promoters, were kind of furious that they lost out to Cow Palace taking the show, and that I thought that they thought they were going to be the promoters for that show.
Yeah, one of the things that in researching the book, is I found that Brian Epstein was a really loyal guy, and the people that supported him in '64 were definitely going to be the people that he was going to go to in '65. There was a huge West Coast promotion team of Lou Robin and Alan Tinkley who turned down the Hollywood Bowl in '64. They thought they could never fill it. Bob Eubanks sold it out pre-internet days in 3.5 hours. Mm-hmm. And so when they came back in '65, Brian Epstein's going to give the show again to Bob Eubanks, even though Robin and Tinkley tried to get it from him. They're also going to give it to Paul Catalana up in San Francisco because he took a chance on him in '64. So, Brian kind of promised it to Big Daddy Tom Donahue. And the other guy, what's his name, Steve? Bobby Bridges, or he was the partner of Big Daddy. They were getting that 65 Cow Palace show, and they didn't get it. So they actually, when the Beatles arrived in San Francisco, they served them with a lawsuit. They threw it in the service guy, the guy that delivers the summons. He threw it in the window of the limousine with the Beatles inside. And Paul McCartney actually has a quote about it that I put in the book, that this dirty guy served him a summons. So Catalana wasn't going to get the show in '66 because of the legal lawsuit that they settled, and giving it to Donahue, who promoted him at Candlestick. It was originally going to be played at Cow Palace in '66. They were going to do 2 shows there, And Norm Weiss sent a telegram to Brian saying, hey, look, we can do one show at Candlestick Park. Would you rather do that than doing two at Cal Palace? So that changed history. That's why Candlestick was the last show they'd ever done. There was the radio wars. You asked about those. I mean, every city there was a huge race to get the Beatles, and generally every city had two, maybe three very powerful AM radio stations. I mean, AM radio led the day back then with all their DJs, the good guys, and this and that. And so they would line up, because if they got the Beatles promotion, guess what? Their ratings are going to be skyrocketing through that whole promotional time. People are going to be listening to that station. But I document in the book several of the wars. The one up in Minnesota was quite notorious. The one in San Diego was actually funny. I mean, they had to actually sue the other radio station to keep this one personality out of the stadium, or not even in the stadium, because this was really the way they made money. I mean, this was huge to them, and they took it very seriously. But yeah, I document all those radio wars in the book.
Would you say L.A. and New York were the worst? Were the biggest? Well, obviously because they were the bigger cities, but I mean, were they the more intense?
I think it was the regional cities that were more intense, because bigger cities had more stations, whereas the regional cities usually had two stations. It was either you listen to station A or you listen to station B. And if you talk to Bruce Spicer, he talks about the competition between the two New Orleans stations. Mm-hmm. And, I think one of them was WTIX, and I think the other, I can't remember the other one, but they're in the book. But yeah, the regional cities were the ones that really, had the really intense wars.
Because when we talked to Dave Hull, I remember Dave Hull telling me that there were some instances where they were getting stuff directly from Capitol, and one of the stations in LA was just absolutely furious that they weren't getting the stuff. And I was in New York during, and heard WABC and WMCA and WINS and heard that stuff going on, and that was if you were living in New York, it was wonderful, but it was wonderfully crazy with all the live reports and everything that were going on during those days. It was absolutely fantastic. So
this has been a very, very fast hour. And it's all to the credit of Chuck Gunderson, who has been a fabulous guest. And Chuck, just want to thank you for coming by and regaling us with some great stories this last hour.
Yeah, it's been great being with you, and hopefully we can do it again when the 50th anniversary of the 66 tour happens next year.
Sure, right.
Chuck, where can people get the book?
They can go directly to my website, somefuntonight.com. They can go to amazon.com. They can go to eBay, or they can go and get a signed copy from the fest.com.
And Steve, speaking of contact, where can people contact us?
People can write to us at Things We Said Today Radio Show at gmail.com. We're also on Twitter at Things We Said Fab. Okay.
And Chuck, are you going to be making any other convention appearances this fall?
Well, I think the conventions are pretty much done for the year.
Yeah, I think so.
I do have on my webpage, if you go to somefuntonight.com, there's a lecture page, and you can book a lecture with me. I will travel to you. The lecture's free. And you can pick from one of four lectures, the 64 tour, the 65 tour, the 66 tour, or your individual city. So it's about a 45-minute multimedia lecture.
That's great. Well, Chuck, again, thanks very much for being with us. And for Alan Kozin and Ken Michaels and Steve Marinucci, this is Al Sussman, and for Things We Said Today, and we will see you next time.